Hello everyone. So today we will be looking at chapter 1 of qualitative research, and we will be looking at how when we make the transition from quantitative research methods to qualitative research methods, we go from what the author calls from recipes to adventures. Now, why do you think the author would use this analogy, in referring to quantitative research methods as recipes and qualitative research methods as adventures? When you're using a recipe, what do you essentially do? Well, one of the first things is that you have a specific set of ingredients, right? And you have very specific procedures, right? Or steps that you need to take in order to ensure that whatever it is that you're baking or whatever it is that you're cooking comes out right? Quantitative research is somewhat similar in the sense that, you have these very specific set of instructions in terms of how you're supposed to, for example, select a sample, right? Or what sort of test you're supposed to run, which is, the specific procedure, right? So, with regards to data analysis as well, you have some very specific guidelines in quantitative research, right? With regards to how are you going to administer whatever tools that you will be using, you have specific set of instructions for that as well, by whoever has created that particular tool, right? What are the steps that you're going to take in, if you're conducting an experiment, what sort of steps are involved in that experiment? So all of that is sort of laid out for you. And what you need to do is that you need to make sure that you follow all of these specific sets of instructions and you follow the procedure really, really well, so that the end product that you get, right, is worth something, right? So in this manner, quantitative research, you can, create this analogy that they are like recipes, right? Now, when you think of adventures, what are some of the things that come to your mind in contrast to recipes? So, with adventures, there's always something, there's always this likelihood that something new will turn up, right? Something new or something unexpected, right? There's also, the need when you're having an adventure, there's always a great need to improvise, right? What does that mean? That, you have a particular situation and you were not very prepared for it. And now you need to think about in terms of, I have these particular resources at hand right now, and I need to do something with the situation in order to make the best of it, right? So qualitative research methods are, similar in being more like an adventure, in the sense that when you're using qualitative methods, there's more likelihood that you will be encountering something completely new, that it will be completely unexpected, and that a lot of times you will need to improvise, right? And that is why when we have qualitative research methods, they really require a lot more training, right? Because, if you're, for example, cooking something, right, and you have specific instructions on how to go about it, right, then, it's a lot easier than if you need to improvise and you need to sort of use your own creativity in, creating whatever it is that you are, right? Hence, in qualitative research, training is something that is very, very essential, right? You need to sort of be very, it's not to say that, because qualitative research is like an adventure, so there is no, there's no there's no preparation for it. There is quite a bit of preparation that you do before you go into the field, before you embark on this adventure, because you want to make sure that you're ready to take on whatever unexpected the field is going to throw at you, whatever new the field is going to throw at you. And in order to do that, you need to have certain skills under your belt, right? Similarly, if you, for example, are going on an adventure on a mountain and you do it without any sort of preparation, right? And that mountain has these wild bears, so it's very likely that the wild bears are going to eat you up if you're not prepared to take appropriate measures to avoid this population of wild bears, right? Or to make your way around them, right? So it's extremely necessary that when you embark on this adventure that you are well prepared, right? And this is why when we talk about qualitative research, right, what we do in this chapter and in this video is that we try to contextualize it, right? And how do we contextualize it? One of the first things that we do is that we think about constructs such as science, right, such as knowledge, and a lot of times we take these words for granted, right? In this video, what we do further is that we problematize these constructs. Now, what does that mean? That means that we really look at the assumptions underlying these constructs and we question those assumptions, right? So what we do in order to do this, what we do is that we look at something that we call epistemology. Now, what exactly is epistemology? Now, epistemology is a branch of philosophy, right? And this branch of philosophy is concerned with investigating what we know, right? And how do we know what we know? So, for example, you might think that that the sun rises from the east. But how do you know this? How do you know whatever it is that you know, right? And what is it that you know, right? So these are the questions that this branch of philosophy concerns itself with, right? Or tries to answer, right? And there are different epistemologies, right, that take different positions on these two questions, which are, what do I know, and then how do I know what I know, right? So the first of these is something that we call positivism. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this term, but basically positivism is also known as the correspondence theory of knowledge. Now, positivism assumes that there is a direct correspondence between the world, right, and our perception of it, right? So whatever there is outside in the world, right, our perception of it corresponds directly to it, right? Now, what does that imply, really? And this might seem very very obvious to most of us, right? That, there's a world out there, right? And we perceive it, right? And there is correspondence between what this world is like and our perception of it, right? And this is really what a lot of quantitative science is built upon, right? However, when we're discussing this here in this context, what we are trying to do is that we're trying to see what is the problem with this, right? that is there actually, is it actually like this, that there's a world out there, right? And our perception of it is a reflection of it, is a direct reflection of it, right? Or is it that our perception is selective, right? In the sense that, we perceive certain things and we leave out certain things, right? So, it's not necessary that our perception corresponds to what is really out there, right? Secondly, because our perception is selective, right? So our understanding of the world, or our perception of the world, is always partial. It's never complete, right? And therefore, so, these observations, and these are things we know through, studying subjects such as cognitive psychology as well, right? So knowing this, then, we cannot really be very, completely supportive of this particular epistemology, which is positivism, which posits that, our perception of the world is a direct reflection of the world itself, and that, our perception directly corresponds to what is out there in the world, right? What positivism really implies, if you truly believe in it, is that because the outside world is something that we can perceive, right, in a holistic manner. That is what positivism assumes, right? So this is the assumption, right? And the implication then is that only if you are objective enough, right, you will be able to see the world for what it is, right? So your perception will really match what is out there if only there is objectivity, right? And this is one of the reasons why there's such an emphasis on being objective, right? In science that we see today, right? But when we have these problems that even if you're trying to be objective, perception is selective, right? And perception is partial. So even this assumption is something that doesn't really hold, right? So this is basically the epistemology of positivism. Right, now we'll move to discussing another epistemological position, which is somewhat related to that of positivism, but is nonetheless different, which is something that we call empiricism, right? Now, empiricism is the assumption that all sorts of knowledge, right, all knowledge is derived from sense perception. So basically, whatever we see, whatever we, touch, hear, sense, right? All of these are sense perceptions, right? So what's happening is that, when you're getting this sense perception, right, you're adding it up until you have knowledge, right? So this is how you gain knowledge according to empiricism. Hence, if you were to put it in better words, right, what you're saying is, if you're an empiricist, that, through the systematic collection, collection plus classification of observations, right, do you get to knowledge. Now let's consider an example here. So you observe every day that the sun rises from the east, right? And that brings you to this knowledge. Now that was your observation, that every day the sun is rising from the east. Now that brings you to this knowledge that the sun always rises from the east in the morning, right? So, this is basically your observation that you had collected, right? Which led you to this knowledge, right? That the sun rises from the east. Now, there are problems with this, sort of this line of reasoning as well, right? So, empiricism basically is marred by two problems. One is that of induction, and the other is what we call the problem of verification. Now, what are these problems? So, basically, we just did an example in which we said that, you look at the sun every morning and you see that it rises from the east, right? And from this, what you do is that you induce, right? Because whenever you're basically working with observations, right? Sorry about that. You're working with observations, and then you use these observations to create knowledge, right? Or to create a theory, right? This method is something that's called induction, right? Whenever you're moving from empirical data, right, to creating theory, this is something that we call induction, right? Right? So basically, your observation was that every day it rises from the east, right? From that, what you induced was that it's going to rise from the east every day. Now, this is not necessary because the next case might just be an exception. If you just think about it, and, we try to logically think about it, there's no sort of logical condition that the sun will rise from the east every day just because it has risen from the east, the past, I don't know how many years, but there's no obligation really. If we talk about it in logical terms, it's not necessary that the sun will rise again from the east tomorrow. It might rise from the west, right? So this is a problem. This is basically what we call the problem of induction. That whenever you're sort of using empirical data to get at a theory, right, it's not necessary that this will hold up because you never know, the next case might just be an exception, right? The next problem is that of verification, right? And the problem of verification is basically that, what you see is that when you're looking at different theories, right, what you see is that, a theory might be able to explain a host of very, very diverse observations, right? And may take all of these observations as evidence of, the veracity of their own theory, right? So, if for example, there is a particular theory and that theory can accommodate very, very diverse observations, right? And not just, explain and accommodate those diverse observations, but also use these diverse observations as proof that that particular theory is true, right? Then this becomes slightly problematic because, these are very different observations. So let's suppose you have very different, manifestations of behaviors, right? And all of those different manifestations of behaviors can be explained by, this theory, right? And not just that, they can be explained by this particular theory, but that they're also being used to show how this theory is actually true, right? So this becomes kind of problematic because then you don't really know exactly what's true and what's not, because usually what you're seeing is that most of the times people become so attached to particular theories that they can explain very diverse observations using the same kind of theory, in the sense that you can apply that theory to each and everything, and that theory will essentially explain anything, right? And this is basically what your problem of verification is, right? So we've identified two kinds of problems. So the first is the problem of verification, which is basically that, when a theory can explain very diverse instances, very diverse, observations, then how do we know, if it's actually true? If there are multiple theories explaining, the same diverse observations, right, in their own particular ways, right? So how do we know which theory to believe, right? And then there is the problem of induction, which is basically that, you never know if, for example, you're building knowledge through sort of in this piecemeal fashion, that you're using sense perception and you're collecting all of these sense perceptions and using them to create knowledge. You never know whether, the same sort of cycle of events will follow. You don't know if the sun will rise from the east each day, for example, right? So these are the two problems that we see here, right? Now, in order to circumvent these two problems, right, Karl Popper came along, right, and he devised a method to really do away with these problems. Now, Karl Popper recognized that, no matter how many times you observe that a particular event follows another particular event, right, you can never really make a categorical statement which says A follows B, because you never know that in the next instance A might stop following B, right? So Karl Popper recognized this, right? And he recognized that with our current ways of thinking, we had this problem of induction. He also saw that, we had this problem with verification, in which, most theories could explain these diverse observations, and all of these theories claimed that these observations, fortified their own theories or strengthened their own theories, right? So he recognized this, and he believed then that, rather than through the process of verification, rather than, going about using observations to verify your theory, you should, start in the opposite manner, right? So knowledge should be produced, according to Karl Popper, should be produced through the process not of verification, right, but of falsification. Right? And so instead of verification, we get falsification, and instead of induction, we get deduction, right? And that is how Karl Popper really circumvents these two problems that we saw in the earlier epistemologies, right? And Karl Popper, he called this method, which works on falsification and deduction, he named it the hypothetical deductive method. And this is basically the method that you use, right, when you're doing quantitative research, right? Because what you're looking at when you're using the hypothetical deductive method is that you have, let's suppose, a particular theory, right? And from that theory, right, you derive a hypothesis, right? And then you design an experiment, or you conduct a research in order to test this hypothesis. So, you test it, and then if you, if the hypothesis is not rejected, right, then this theory is sort of, it's lent more support, right? But if the hypothesis is rejected, then you can move towards rejecting the theory as well, right? So that's why whenever we're doing stats, we always have these null hypotheses, because we're working on, rather than verifying, we're working on falsification, right? And we're always using deduction, right? So deduction is the opposite method, in which what you're doing is that you have a theory and you're deriving hypotheses from the theory, right? So this process is what is called deduction. All right? And then you test these hypotheses. If your hypothesis is not rejected, then that lends support to the theory. If it is rejected, then you can say that the theory is not very the theory perhaps is not true, right? So yes, so this is the basis of the hypothetical deductive method, which is what is used in quantitative research, right? This is the whole background of it. Now what we'll do is that we'll look at now, because we're talking about qualitative research, right? So we will look at certain critiques of the hypothetical deductive method, and we'll basically look at what is wrong with this method. All right, so more on this in the next video.